afternoon. I'm Dr. Jana Martin, Chief Executive Officer of the American Insurance Trust, known to most of you simply as the Trust. We're delighted that you're able to join us virtually today for the first of our two-part Psypact Roundtables. We have a very special guest joining us today to co-present with Dr. Liesl Bryant. Ms. Janet Orwig, MBA CAE, is with the Association of State and Provincial Psychology Boards, known to many of you as ASPPB, where she serves as the Associate Executive Officer, Member Services. And she is Psypact Executive Director. She is responsible for monitoring state and regulatory and legislative actions and overseeing member services, including the Psychology Interjurisdictional Compact, also known as Psypact. I hope you benefit immensely from this Psypact Roundtable. We want to thank you for joining us, and we want to thank our speakers in advance. Thank you, Ms. Orwig, for joining us today. So please all join me in welcoming Dr. Bryant and Ms. Orwig.
Great. Thanks so much, Jana. And welcome to all of you. We are really delighted to be here today with you guys, and we're really excited to have Ms. Orwig. We get a lot of questions on Psypact in particular, and she's going to do, we're changing the format just a little bit today. She's actually going to start with a very brief sort of intro to give us some basic information. She has some slides, which you'll see popping up here in just a moment. And then we have a series of questions that we sort of compiled from the questions, most asked questions that we get from you all on sort of a daily basis. So we're going to run through all of those first. There's more than we usually get through, and then we will turn to the live questions. So we're hoping to get to all the live questions, but we also want to get through the ones that we have here in advance. And so definitely do, as Jana said, go ahead and please type in your questions into the Q&A. What we don't get to today, hopefully we'll get to in the second part. But that being said, Ms. Orwig, I will turn it over to you to start this initial part.
So is my slide showing up correctly? Is it the way they should look, or am I in presenter mode?
I believe you might be in presenter mode.
Okay, let me stop that and let me start again. I thought I picked the wrong one. Hold on just a moment.
Okay, no problem. So, yeah, so while she's, oops, here it comes, okay.
It does the same thing, I think. It did the same.
Let's see, it's still loading, so we'll give it just a moment.
Oh.
Oops, and then it didn't come.
Okay. We may do it without the presentation.
Well, I believe they have a, they may have a link over here in the chat box to the slides. So if need be, you could just talk through them if we have to.
Okay.
I believe that they.
I think it's just going to come up in this unless I.
Yep, you got it. That's it. Perfect.
That's correct?
Yep. Perfect.
All right. Well, I apologize for the technology difficulty. It's always very embarrassing when you're going to do a presentation on something doing with technology and your technology fails. So I apologize for that. And just wanted to go through 2 or 3 different slides to just cover a few things before we started the question and answers. And I don't want to take too much time away from those because I know that's very important to get to. So I just wanted to talk about my conflicts of interest. As stated, I am an employee of ASPPB as well as of the Psypact Commission. We are here to talk today about Psypact, which stands for the Psychology Interjurisdictional Compact. And it is an interstate compact, and I won't go into too much details about that, but one of probably the best examples of an interstate compact is your driver's license, which allows you to drive across state lines without having to stop at that state border and get a new license. So Psypact functions a little bit like a driver's license, and it is designed to regulate telepsychology and the temporary in-person face-to-face practice of psychology for up to 30 days in another Psypact member jurisdiction. And it only covers psychology and psychologists. There are some additional compacts coming out, are already out, dealing with other mental health professions. The counseling has a compact right now, as well as social work. So those are some compacts being addressed by other mental health professions. A little bit of the history. ASPPB is made up of the licensing boards for psychology across the US and Canada. And they heard back in 2011 from their member boards that they needed to figure out a way to address the regulation of telepsychology. They knew it was happening across state lines and they didn't have a way to regulate it. So ASPPB created the Telepsych Task Force back in 2011, and they worked on this little issue till 2015. And in February of 2015, they created the Psypact language. It was a little late to get it into the legislative world that year. So it actually, the first state was enacted in May of 2016, and that was Arizona. In April of 2019, Georgia became the 7th state. And why that is important is that every compact has kind of a magic number that you have to have enact in order for legislation for the commission to stand up and they start to be able to offer services under the compact. For Psypact, it was 7. So they had their first commission meeting in July of 2019. And we were able to start issuing our first authorizations to practice under Psypact in July of 2020. Something I want to really, one of the things I want to highlight is, as I said in my last slide, ASPPB was kind of the creator of Psypact. It was their brainchild. But once the commission was formed and it had its first meeting in July of 2019, it became a separate entity. It is considered a quasi-governmental agency because it is made up of one representative from each of the states that have enacted the legislation. So it's an instrumentality of those member states. ASPPB is responsible for the e-passport and the interjurisdictional practice certificate, as well as the renewal of those 2 items. The Psypact Commission deals with the authorization to practice interjurisdictional telepsychology, or the APIT, the temporary authorization to practice, or the TAP, the renewal of both of those, and all the rules, policy, bylaws, and the day-to-day runnings of Psypact as we go forward as far as how it's managed. Right now, we have 40 jurisdictions that have enacted the legislation. We have 39 that are effective. Vermont did enact this year, but they have an effective date of July of 2024. We still have active legislation in Massachusetts and New York. Their session goes until the end of the year. We really haven't seen any movement with the bill at all in New York. The Massachusetts bill did have a joint hearing because we have a House bill and a Senate bill, but they didn't vote on it, and we haven't seen any movement since they had that joint hearing. How it works overall is, like I said, the states enact Psypact, the commission was established, and that state, when it acts, it sends another commissioner. If a psychologist wants to practice under Psypact, they have to have to do telepsychology, they have to have the authority to practice interjurisdictional telepsychology, or the APIT. That allows them to practice telepsychology into a receiving state. If you have an e-passport, that is a component that is required for the APIT, but if you only have an e-passport and have never finished your APIT, you are not allowed to practice under the authority of Psypact. You have to have that APIT because only the commission can issue that authority. If you are wanting to do the temporary component, you have to have the temporary authorization to practice issued by the Psypact Commission, and that allows you to conduct temporary in-person face-to-face practice into another Psypact jurisdiction or a distant state for up to 30 days in a calendar year. The interjurisdictional practice certificate, or the IPC, that is issued by ASPPB is a component of that TAP authorization, but you have to have the TAP authorization to be able to practice under Psypact. As of the 21st, we had over 11,000 APIT holders and 627 TAP holders. Our website contains lots of information. It provides where our meetings are, who our commissioners are. You can find the statutes, the rules, the regs, the policies, all of that information, as well as a current map, and also can sign up for our listserv so that you can get notifications as they go forward. And my last slide is thank you. And this is my contact information, as well as Gina Polk, who is the Psypact specialist. I do want to stress that we have been very fortunate to have a HRSA grant that has funded many of the items that I mentioned in my presentation. Thank you. And now we'll go to questions and answers.
Great, thank you for that overview. I do want, as you're going through it, I was reminded of all the acronyms. So I want to just remind the folks who are participating, there is a link in the chat box of Psypact acronyms and terms, because we'll probably keep using the acronyms as we go through today. So if at any point you get lost and you want to know what's the acronym, please just click on that link and you'll figure it out there. So. All right, Ms. Orwig. So I'm going to start, as you know, we have a bunch of different topics we're going to go through.
Okay.
Some of them I think are pretty straightforward and others of them may be a little more complex. So let's start with one that's a big one for many of our callers, and that is this issue of a home state requirement, because this really comes up over and over again. And some people have been pretty distressed about it because they see it as actually posing some barriers to, interjurisdictional practice, which I know is sort of the opposite of, right? You're there to decrease barriers. So can you first just start by explaining what the home state requirement is?
Okay, so in order to practice under Psypact, you have to declare a home state. And if you're going to do the telepsychology component, your home state, you have to be licensed in that home state. It has to be a Psypact participating state, and you have to be physically present from that state when you are providing services. So you will declare that as part of your APIT application as to what your home state is going to be. But it is where you're licensed, where you're going to be practicing from, and it does have to be a Psypact state.
Okay, so to concretize that, let's say that I don't have my e-passport and APIT, but if I did and I was practicing in New Hampshire, which is one of the states I'm licensed in, I would have to be physically located in New Hampshire in order to practice under Psypact, correct?
Correct.
So if I left New Hampshire and go to another Psypact state or another non-Psypact state, I can't practice under the Psypact when I do that, correct? When I'm outside.
Certainly not under a non-Psypact state. If you go to another Psypact state that you hold a license, you can change your home state in your APIT application section of PsyPro and declare, say, if you wanted to spend 6 months in Minnesota and 6 months in Florida, you can change your home state if you have a license in both of those states. But if you don't have a license in that Psypact state, you cannot do services under Psypact. You may be able to go back to your New Hampshire clients under that law and however that state you're sitting in reflects on it, but you wouldn't be practicing under Psypact.
Okay, so in some regards, that's different than sort of practice either pre-Psypact or in non-Psypact, if someone's not in Psypact, where generally speaking, states have taken the sort of interpretation that the service is occurring where the client is. But under Psypact, right, that's almost flipped because the service is thought to be occurring where the clinician is. Can you sort of explain maybe why that is and how that came to be?
Well, one was talking about the timeline of 2011 to 2015. That seemed like a really long time to try to figure out what to do with regulating telepsychology. And the biggest issue during that time was, how are you going to manage a disciplinary complaint? If you are not, everything is up in the atmosphere, how are you going to manage that? And so home state was set up that way because the only body that can take a disciplinary action is the state that holds your license. So that is why it was set up that you have to physically be in that home state practicing under your home state license so that they have the authority to conduct the disciplinary sanction if needed.
Okay, I see. And so that suggests to me, correct me if this is wrong, but suggests to me that the home state requirement is not something that's likely to change moving forward, that's sort of a permanent piece.
It is, and we actually have a legal opinion that we had drafted, and on the Psypact website, I think they may have put it into one of the links, that it is on our Psypact website under our commission tab, under where you can find the statutes, the policies, the rules, and all that, and we do put our legal opinion there. So it states very cleanly that we have to do it this way, and as much as I hear everybody, and I would love to be able to change it, based on that, I am not able to make any modifications to it.
Okay. Well, that's at least very clear. I think one of the things that comes up, and you may or may not even really be able to speak to this, but I think one of the problems that comes up is, let's say that, again, let's take a clinician, say licensed in North Carolina, which I'm pretty sure is
it is.
Psypact state, and that clinician now goes on vacation for 2 weeks to California. And let's say they have a Psypact patient that they've been working with in Maine. And while that clinician is in California on vacation or work or whatever it happens to be, the Maine client calls the clinician in crisis. Technically, if I understand you correctly, you're saying that it would not be legal for that practitioner to call back and provide crisis intervention services to their patient in Maine under the current Psypact rules. Is that accurate?
That is accurate, yes.
Okay, yeah, okay, well, that's it. Again, at least it's clear. It poses some pretty significant, I think, barriers and difficult challenges, I should say, maybe for clinicians. So, but we'll come back to some of those probably in part 2 more, but thank you for clarifying. That's very helpful. So, okay, still sticking with the home state issue, to go through a couple, because we get lots of different questions about, well, what if it's this and what if it's that? So I'm going to put a couple of these to you.
Okay.
So let's say that if a psychologist is licensed in multiple Psypact states, as you said, they can change their home state
Yes.
when they travel in between. I presume that process is pretty easy to do if they're traveling in
Yes.
between states. Okay.
Yes, they when they did their original application, they set their they go back where they go back into Psypro, and beside their APIT under their My Application or My Application Summary History, there's a button to change home state. You just click it and you would put in your new home state, and the new date is that it would go effective.
Okay. And now we have this question a lot too, especially for clinicians that are sort of in border cities or right around, states where they may be, like Vermont, Maine, New Hampshire, Massachusetts, on sort of those borders. If they're maybe practicing in both states, maybe, one day of the week in one state and the next day of the other, is it possible for ease of travel to declare dual home states, or do you have to just do it as just one and change it each time?
Currently, you have to do it as one. This is an issue that the Rules Committee is discussing. All of the Psypact Commission meetings and committee meetings are open to the public. So if you want to come sit in on a Rules Committee meeting, you can. And they are looking at and talking about that situation. If you have, especially like in Maryland, DC, and Virginia, could you do where you could put all 3 of those in? So they are talking about it. And have been addressing some of the concerns by doing that. How are we going to address some of the other things and software changes and things like that? But they are discussing it. But at this time, you do have to put it as a single home state.
Okay. Okay. So that's great. That's something to sort of keep an eye on, because that may change moving forward.
Yes.
Okay. Terrific. So another offshoot of this then, and this is a slightly different, let's say that we have a clinician who has their APIT, right, practices, let's say in Maryland, and that's their state of licensure. And now this clinician travels to Maine, which is a Psypact state, although I'm not sure that matters in this example. I understand from what you said that when the clinician is in Maine, they cannot practice under Psypact, right? But if it's a Maryland licensed psychologist.
Correct.
Right? Okay.
Correct.
Now, could they, though, see their patients back in Maryland only? So in essence, practicing under, quote, just their Maryland license rather than Psypact patients?
They could. I would strongly suggest checking with the Maine board to make sure they don't consider that practicing in that state without a license. Some of them don't necessarily look at where the patient is. They look at where the psychologist is as well. But yes, they wouldn't be practicing under Psypact. In that case, they would be practicing under the authority of their Maryland license, back to their Maryland patients.
Okay, terrific. Yeah, and we would second your recommendation there that they check with both boards, because some states would allow that and some wouldn't. But yes, okay, that's great though, just to get the clarity that in essence they'd go back to their, like you say, their original licensing board laws, and that would that's what would govern there. Okay. So one of the questions we get, I think this is a pretty straightforward answer, but does having an APIT and the e-passport in any way preclude a clinician from providing care into a non-Psypact state under that non-Psypact state's temporary licensing law?
No, you're practicing outside of Psypact. We have no authority or control over a non-Psypact state.
Okay, great. So then it, in essence, reverts back to those state laws. And the other question we get is, if a clinician has a client that moves to a non-Psypact state, so let's say California, for instance, can they use Psypact to treat them?
No, they would have to get a license in that state,
Correct. Great.
or a temporary license if they want to do that till they can get another, practitioner, but they would have to do something with California.
Yes. Okay. Perfect. Great. Okay. So we might end up with a ton of other questions in the live questions in a few minutes, but I want to switch and go to a slightly different topic, which has to do with the rule under Psypact about state laws to protect the health and safety of their citizens, right? So as you know, the rules, I believe it's 4.10, says that a psychologist practicing under the APIT into a receiving state is subject to that receiving state's laws, specifically the laws that protect the health and safety of its citizens. And the rules further go on to sort of define what that means, to define the state law to protect health and safety. And they say that it's a statute, a regulation, court decision, or other controlling authority within that state. And it lists in the rules some examples of laws that would fall within that category. So those examples are things like child abuse reporting or elder abuse reporting. Also issues around securing informed consent. If someone's at risk of harm to themselves or others, and there's a couple others in there that they include. But one of the things that I think is hard for clinicians is that it's it seems kind of ambiguous in a way, right? Because it doesn't list every law. So how does a clinician practicing under the APIT, how do they know which laws they're responsible for knowing and for abiding by in the receiving state?
So, this was added because originally it just said you would be practicing under the scope of practice into the receiving state. And we needed some clarification because a lot of the additional things that are listed here are a little bit outside of the scope of practice, but you still need to be practicing under the authority of that state's citizens to protect their citizens. We do try to provide on the Psypact website a list of all of our member states, their licensing laws, and to their websites and stuff to provide that information. But it's hard to say exactly which ones you would, I'm trying to figure out how best to say this. It is very hard to figure out this one or this one or this one, but it always is to err in the side of what's going to be in the best protection of that citizen of that state or of your consumer of the services. To always err on that side. We have a training and public relations committee that is working to beef up the licensing board contact page to include links to the rules that these would fall under. Hopefully we will be able to work with our Psypact states to get those links and add those in. We talked about trying to do some kind of informational page, but we were afraid that things would change. And trying to keep that current. It was much easier to say, okay, states, tell us where we need to send people and let us put those links and make sure those links stay current than it was to try to do a document and make sure it stayed current. So it will require a little bit of research on the psychologist part, but we are trying to make some materials that will make it easier to find those answers.
Okay, well I'm glad to hear that. I think this is actually quite challenging because on the one hand, the rules say that we as clinicians are responsible for knowing the certain laws in the receiving state. And yet it sounds like even you guys are a little unclear as to which laws those would be. So it's a little tricky for us. It's like we as psychologists are being held accountable for something, and yet we don't know what that is exactly.
I guess we've tried to figure out, it would be the same as if you got a license. Let's say you were licensed in Georgia, because that's where I am, and you want to go get a license in South Carolina. You're going to learn the laws that you have to abide by in South Carolina while you have that license. You're going to learn what your, informed consent needs to look like, what your record keeping is, all of that. It's the same thing, whether it's in person practice or if it's through telepsychology and Psypact, you still need to learn the same things you would learn that you learned when you got your license in that state.
I see. So, okay. So then tell me if I'm hearing you right. The laws that are defined as quote unquote protecting the health and safety of the citizens, from Psypact's perspective, that really includes any laws that I would have to learn and know if I were licensed in the other state.
regarding to scope of practice or protection of the citizens. Yes.
Wow, okay, because that's pretty expansive. You know, that of course would include certainly the ones that are listed in the rules, but also things like minor consent laws and states with red flag laws, impaired provider laws, laws about records, you know, when you release and when you don't, when you release like testing data and when you don't. So I think that is broader than perhaps many clinicians who are practicing under Psypact really understand. My other question then related to that is, you know, sort of a practical issue, which is, you know, it's not only, I think when you move to another state, let's say that I'm moving to, I don't know, well, I guess Montana's not, let's say Nevada, let's say I move to Nevada and, you know, I can steep myself in the law. I can easily talk with other practitioners to say, how's this law interpreted? Is there case law here? But when we're not in the state, we're not connected into that local loop. It can be tricky to not only know like what laws do I have to know, where do I find them, but also right, how's it interpreted in that particular state? Are there court legal decisions that impact how it's interpreted? So I'm wondering, and maybe you don't have an answer to this, but if you do, what's your what's Psypact's recommendation for how clinicians get that level of detail, which is really the level they're going to need to be able to practice in as you say, as if they were licensed in that state?
That is a question I don't think I can answer, but what I would like to do is I will certainly take this whole conversation back to the training and PR committee, because that is the committee that's tasked with trying to do our educational components. And trying to figure out a way to address some of these concerns. We do realize that it's here. And like I said, that's one reason why we made the page on the website, to make it easier to find statutes and rules and not have to go to the state sites and dig through and try to find. But we are still, like I said, we've been going since 2019, but we are still pretty young and learning, and we are adding new things all the time. So I will take this back to that group for them to talk about how we can continue to provide resources for psychologists going forward. One of the things that we are working on right now is our strategic plan. And that is a big component, was educational and materials. We sent out a survey to all of our authorization holders, and we heard back from about 1,200 of those. So we were really pleased with that turnout. That was a really good turnout for what we, you know, when sending the survey. And a lot of it was the educational materials. That was probably the number one request. So we are very much aware of that, and we'll continue to work on that.
Okay, yeah, I think that would be really helpful. And because also not necessarily all of the laws are in one place, you know, so if you're asking states, they're all over the place sometimes. So it can be,
yes.
So that would be really nice if there was the creation of some sort of online database that clinicians could go to and just click, okay, I'm in, you know, North Carolina today. What do I, you know, how do I get to that? That'd be really valuable, I think. So one of this is sort of an offshoot or sort of connected to that, you know, it did, and I don't know if I mentioned it or not, but one of the things that it talks about, of course, are the rules or the laws in each state about informed consent, because different states do have different laws about what has to be included and how do you get that and how do you document that. And I think this is pretty significant too, because I'm not sure if many people or most clinicians practicing under APIT realize then that they, in essence, correct me if I'm wrong from Psypact's perspective, but will need to have separate informed consents for each state, because they have to comply with that state's informed consent laws, correct?
Correct.
Okay. So,
you know, it's interesting. Some of the practice things we don't get as heavy involved in Psypact. It's more the regulation of the practice itself, but not necessarily the individual practice components. So I do refer them to you guys for samples of informed consents and things like that. But because we do not have a sample and we don't have anything provided on a state-by-state basis.
Okay. No, and we do have some templates on our website. They're of course very broad though, and what we recommend is that each person in each state, you know, you have to take that and make it specific to the state you're practicing in. And I think this is something, you know, we'll take back to our risk management team as well, and we'll talk more about risk management strategies for how to deal with this in the part 2 that's coming up in just a couple of weeks. But for now, I think it is really important that all practitioners understand this issue about informed consent and the laws, because I know there are some practitioners who are practicing in many, many states, as you said, now 40 member states, 39 of which are active. If you've got clients in 20 of those, that means you're responsible for all of those laws and in essence 20 perhaps different informed consents. So that's pretty onerous for clinicians. So we'll be, I'm glad for this discussion, and then we'll be thinking through maybe some more resources for that as well. Okay, so one last piece before we move on to a different topic related to this rule issue, because this too comes up and I think is really a challenge. What happens when the laws conflict? So again, let's say that I'm a New Hampshire, that's my home state, that's where I'm licensed, and now I'm practicing into Nevada. Or actually, let's switch that. Let's say I've got a patient in Texas. I'm in New Hampshire, that's my home state. I have a client in Texas, and there's a tear-off issue, meaning, my patient has now threatened to harm somebody. And in New Hampshire, that under certain contexts, that would absolutely be I'd be mandated to do something about that, to, duty to protect, and I might have to breach confidentiality to ensure safety. In Texas, however, that's not true. So which state law do I abide by? The Texas law where the patient is, or my New Hampshire law where I am?
That would come under, I believe, the protecting of the citizens laws, the duty to warn, and you would go by the Texas law. In documenting all of that in the informed consent, you want to make sure that you have documented that that's what the state is and what you were doing. It's one of those that it feels very wrong to say that because you're in your state and you have this law. And so it feels wrong, but the way Psypact is designed, it is meant that you would abide by the receiving state's law to protect their citizens. If it's uncomfortable, you may not want to take that patient because it may be, just because of that, but it is the way that the law is set up, the way our rules are set up.
So, and I know we're going to get to this in a minute, but because I think also we'll talk about board complaints. But if I have to abide by Texas's law, will I then not be judged by New Hampshire law if and when there's a complaint and my New Hampshire board is looking at whether I acted appropriately? They're not going to judge me based on a New Hampshire standard. They'll judge me based on Texas standard.
They should judge you based on the standards by where the patient is located.
Wow. Okay. So I guess I wonder, so many questions come to mind about this, but so, duty to warn is one, but then also what about records release issues? So if let's say someone is asking me for records, I would then release records on the basis of, say, Texas law or Nevada law, but not on the basis of New Hampshire law. Is that right?
That one is one I haven't had that question come up, but I think that would fall under the same 4.10. I would not say that it would be different. Wow.
Okay. So that, what that is suggesting to me is that clinicians it's really as if they are practicing in another state.
Yes.
So they really have to have a pretty fine understanding of the laws and how that works. It's pretty intricate. So am I hearing that correctly?
Yes. Yes, it is. You're practicing like you may physically be sitting here, but you're still practicing like you're in that receiving state.
Okay. Okay, so let's move then to that board complaint process, because I think there's a couple things there too. This is really helpful. The answers, I think this is going to be helpful not only for us here at the Trust and the risk management team, but also for the folks that were, to get clarity on these issues. It's just so valuable. So maybe we'll just start with the easy part, I hope. And if you can maybe just walk us through how would a board complaint process work? Let's say that my home state is in New Hampshire and I was treating someone in North Carolina, and my patient in North Carolina files a complaint. What happens?
They're going to file a complaint with the North Carolina board because that's where they're located. North Carolina can do a cease and desist or an injunction and say you can't practice here under Psypact any longer. They will notify the commission as well as your New Hampshire board, which can look at the documentation and they would be looking at whether or not to take action against your license based on what happened in North Carolina. If North Carolina takes an injunction or a cease and desist, that is considered a disciplinary action. It would become a public disciplinary action, and you're going to lose your authority to practice under Psypact. You cannot have had any disciplinary action and maintain your practice cannot maintain your authorizations to practice under Psypact. So you're going to lose that based on North Carolina, and then they're going to refer everything to New Hampshire, because as we talked about, that's where the teeth is, that's where your license is, and they're going to look at it and work together with the North Carolina board to decide how to proceed against if or take any action against your license.
Okay, and I want to just make sure I understood something. If the patient files a complaint against me in North Carolina, and again, my home state's New Hampshire, did you say that North Carolina, I think you said they can issue a cease and desist, but they wouldn't necessarily do that during the investigation process, or would they? If there's a complaint, do they automatically say that I can't practice in?
No. They would do an investigation, but they can treat it a little bit almost like practicing without a license, because they don't have a license to take an action against. So they're going to do something like either a cease and desist or an injunction once they have investigated. They're not going to do it just because they've gotten a complaint. They're going to have to do a process of investigation. Yes.
Okay, so it would come through, yes, exactly, through the investigatory process. Okay, no, that
Correct.
makes sense. Now,
Correct.
one thing I noticed in the rules that I think is interesting is that, so again, let's take that same example. I get a complaint against me in North Carolina. When that happens, I then cannot change my home state anymore, correct?
Correct. Correct.
So if I typically, because I am licensed in multiple states, let's say that I travel frequently from Maine to New Hampshire and Mass, and I've got offices in all of those, and maybe every week I'm in each of those offices one day a week. So now I get this board complaint in North Carolina. I then can no longer toggle between New Hampshire, Maine, and Massachusetts, correct?
Correct.
So
the
yes,
reasoning that was done was to not add another home state in, trying to figure out, right now you've got just the two states. If you bring in some of those others and changing your home state, they may get involved as well. And they probably will be notified, because the commission notifies all states when something comes in. But right now they wouldn't be part of that investigation process. But if you changed your home state, they would get pulled in and have to be part of the whole process as well, because you hold a license in those states.
I see. Yeah, so I see how that sort of simplifies the investigatory process in a way, and maybe there's some protection for the clinician, but from a continuity of care for patients, that's potentially very problematic, because in that scenario, that would mean that if I have a board complaint, whether justified or not, but if I get a board complaint in North Carolina, that means that while that's going through the investigatory process, I can no longer then see my patients when I'm in, say, Massachusetts or in Maine under APIT. Because I would have to be physically in New Hampshire in order to do that.
Correct.
Wow, okay. Okay, so more clarity is coming through, which is really helpful. So, okay, let's see. Oh, yes, one other thing I wanted to just clarify. If, let's say that I had some adverse action against my license, wherever that is it accurate that then I'm not eligible to practice at all, as you said, under APIT or under Psypact at all?
Correct.
Okay, and is that permanently, meaning if I have something I can never again practice under Psypact?
Currently, that is correct. You cannot have had any adverse action.
Okay, so there's no distinction between, say, an adverse action for something like not getting all my CE credits in versus having sex with a patient, neither of which anyone would do, of course, but okay, so really once you have a founded board complaint, at any point you lose forever the possibility to practice under Psypact.
Correct.
Okay. Okay. Oh, yes. And the very last thing that we'll get to before maybe we'll start taking some live questions is the issue of supervision, which I know, and as you know, has been a pretty big topic as of late. And maybe you can just clarify what Psypact says, because for trainees, and then let us know a little bit about, because I know there were some questions about the proposed rule change. People thought that meant something was changing when it isn't actually. So I'll let you speak to that for a few minutes.
Okay, so one of the questions that we received a lot was, can trainees practice under the authority of their supervisor's APIT or TAP, depending on, mostly APIT was where the concern came from. And we had that question a lot, and it doesn't do that. So we added, Rules Committee reviewed that and came up with 4.13 and 5.13, which says that the authorization holder is who is the only, APITs can only go to the authorization holder. They cannot be delegated to anyone else. The statute very specifically lays out what an authorization holder is, what they have to do. So because we're tied by the statute, you can't delegate your authority to a trainee. Does not mean that you can't supervise. And if I'm in Georgia and I want to supervise somebody in Alabama, if they do the proper review with the Alabama board and make sure that's okay in Alabama, and I do the proper thing here in Georgia, I can do that through Psypact. I can supervise, but I cannot have my trainee then do practice with somebody in North Carolina under my Psypact, because I can't delegate that to a trainee. So that's, we weren't changing anything. We were trying to clarify that it only applies to the authorization holder.
Aha, great. No, thank you. I think that is really important to the clarity. And I appreciate too that you highlight we can do supervision. So that is within our scope of practice. It is the, you know, the definition of the practice of psychology. We can do that cross-jurisdictionally under the APIT. We just, our trainees cannot practice cross-jurisdictionally. So, okay, that's, yeah, really helpful. And I know that's going to be disappointing to many folks hearing that, and yet it just is what it is, and it's crystal clear. So, okay, so I think at this point, thank you so much, Ms. Orwig. This has been really, really helpful in many different directions. And I see Jan is on, who's going to talk to us a little bit. I think you're going to go through some of the online questions for us, right?
Well, of course, we don't have any at all.
Right.
It's been hard to keep track of them all. But I think that where I would start is there still seems to be some confusion about the difference between APIT and the e-passport and how they are different and how you get each one of them. So Janet, could you go over that again for us, please?
Sure. Sure. So when you look at the Psypact statute, there is a list of things that you have to have in order to get the authorization to practice under Psypact. One of those is that you have to have an e-passport. The e-passport is a certificate that is issued by ASPPB. So what we did when we did an application process where you apply, you pay for both. You do your e-passport and your APIT at the same time when you start your application. You're going to do all the components for the e-passport. Once you have that, you'll get a notification to go in and start your APIT. And most of what you're going to do in your APIT is review that the document's still correct. You're going to do it. There's an attestation and an acknowledgement form you have to complete, and then you have to declare your home state. But you have to have that. ASPPB sends the Psypact Commission a letter that says, yes, Dr. Martin has an e-passport and it's good to this date. And we use that to verify as we go through with our APIT process. So there are two different certificates, but you have to have the e-passport to get the APIT, and you have to have the APIT to practice under Psypact.
Right. So it's not it's not either one. It's a both.
Right.
Okay.
You have to have both.
Okay, great. And you just mentioned home state, and you talked about that earlier. There are a couple of questions about that. So one is, how often can you change your home state? And does it cost anything for you to change it?
You can change it as many times as you want, and it doesn't cost you anything.
Okay. And how long does the process take to change it?
You log in, you go to your home page where you have your application summary, and like I said, beside your little APIT, there's a blue button that says declare home state. You click it, you put your state in and save it, and that's it. It shouldn't be very long at all.
Yeah, so when you make the request online, nobody has to review it and say, okay, we've gotten this. Once you've done it online, then you've changed the home state. And so you can do it frequently. You don't have to wait, and it's immediate as soon as you do it.
Correct.
Okay, good, good. Here's another question. Do you still have to reside in a Psypact state to be Psypact credentialed, or is it now enough to be licensed in a Psypact state?
You can be licensed in a Psypact state to get the credential, but if you're going to practice under it, you have to be in that state where you hold the license. So let's say you are in California and you have a license in Nevada. If you're going to, and you use your Nevada license to get your APIT, you have to be in Nevada when you're providing services.
Okay, yes, all right. Here's another one. This is an international question. If the psychologist is out of the country, can we still practice?
That is outside my jurisdiction. I can't answer that question. I would think no, but I only deal with my little 40 states. So,
but
I think the point is that Psypact has nothing to do with international practice.
it does not.
Yeah. Yeah.
No, and Jan, I'm not sure what the question was there, but if the practitioner is saying, can they then practice back in the US in general, then yes, I agree, Psypact has nothing to say. If the question is, can I practice back into the US under my APIT, then the answer to that would be no, because we're not physically in the home state when providing the services.
Right, right. And related to that, there are a lot of questions there phrased differently from each other, but the essence is the same. People are really still confused about, well, what if I have a 2-week business trip and I am traveling to a state, I have Psypact and my home is registered in a Psypact state, but I have this business trip and I'm not going to be in my home state anymore. Can I practice under Psypact?
No. I mean, the requirements are you have to be physically in your home state.
Right, right. I just wanted to reiterate that because it is asked a lot. I know you've addressed that before.
It's interesting because I've talked with some of the other compacts and they all have a little different take on home state, but that seems to be one of the most pain points of all of the compacts is how you address home state. And, and nobody likes it in any of the compacts. It's always a very difficult conversation to have.
Right. Right.
And so can I ask Jana, before you jump in, if I can ask just another so let's imagine theoretically, and of course I would never do this, but let's go back to that example, maybe make it a little more practical, that again, my home state, say I'm licensed in New Hampshire, that's my home state. I now am in Nevada for business and my patient calls me in a crisis, right? So I have 2 or 3 crisis sessions with my patient, say a Psypact, a main patient, right? Where I'm not licensed, but I have my APIT and I'm practicing there. That technically you're saying is not allowed. So I guess if a complaint were filed against me in that capacity, what it would be, I mean, I then may get in trouble for practicing without a license, or I stand to potentially lose my ability to practice under Psypact. I mean, what would be the consequence of that if I chose to treat my crisis client, right? Because you see how it pits me against the other thing, which is to do no harm to my patient.
Yeah, I am not quite sure, because if you're throwing in, if you're, we talked about if your patient was back in your home state where your license is, then you're doing that from Nevada, and Nevada says that's fine, that's okay. I think it would, I don't know the answer to that, and who would take action on that. I have written down this because I do want to take this back to the rules committee to have a conversation about. I don't know that we have any leeway or any wiggle room with what our legal opinion says about home state and all that, but I do see where there is a major concern if you have a patient in crisis. How do you deal with that? And if you're not in your home state. And so I would like to take that back to the rules committee and have them at least talk about that. Is there, and get our attorney to join us at that time, is there some wiggle room or something we can do with that? I can't make any promises, but I certainly will take it back to them for them to consider.
Well, that would be great. Thank you. Because I think that's a pretty significant issue.
Right, right. And I think that, there are several questions here too about does the trust insurance policy cover people when they are practicing under Psypact? And the answer is, it's in the insurance world, there's always a qualified answer, but the basic answer is, well, yes, as long as you're following the laws and you're practicing legally. And that would be true whether you're in Psypact or not. So you're covered if you are practicing within your scope of practice that you're licensed to do, and you're practicing legally. So if you are practicing and you don't have Psypact, and you haven't checked into temporary laws and you're doing it routinely, then you would be practicing without a license in that state. And so that would be difficult and problematic for you. So doing good practice and knowing that you're following the laws is important. So just wanted to clarify that as well. There are a lot of questions that are very similar, some questions about billing, but I know that's not something we want to get into at this point because you don't know the answer to those questions. I'm searching for another one that I had. It seems like states who sign on to Psypact could accept that practitioners providing telehealth through Psypact will follow the rules of the state where the practitioner is licensed. Wouldn't this make sense? States are already waiving requirements to become licensed in that state for telehealth.
It makes sense.
Yes, but Psypact has no authority over.
No, our statute ties our hands. Yeah.
And I think that's something that a lot of people don't understand, is that Psypact doesn't have the ability to make states change their laws. It's very important for folks to understand that. It's a limited scope of authority that Psypact can give or deal with. So.
Right. And I'll add there, Jana, states do, I think a lot of states would be hesitant to completely give that up because it is their job to protect their citizens. And so just say, well, yeah, we'll allow some other state to weigh in on that. I think not many states are going to want to do that.
Right.
Although you said something there about, I think you read that someone said the states are waiving issues for practicing.
Yeah.
I want to jump in on that and say that's not true.
Right. Right.
To clarify really clearly, yes, there were some waivers, some loosening of restrictions during COVID. Right. All of those, I'm pretty sure I can say all of them. That is now expired. There are no active waivers. There's no loosening of, so please, for all of you listening and those listening later, do not assume that you can practice legally under some waiver that was active during COVID, because I don't think there's a single one of those that's still in effect currently.
Right. I think that what does exist, though, as you all both have talked about, is there are still temporary practice laws in states, but every state is different and they have different requirements, different time periods, different abilities to practice. Some of them require that you fill out a form. Some of them give you the ability to practice for 30 days, but they count a day as if you do one session one day, it's one day. If you do 7 sessions one day, it's one day. So you have to be aware of what those state laws are for temporary practice into that state. But that's different than a waiver.
Yes.
Yeah.
And to add on, because I know we're going to run a little short on time, maybe Jana, you can fit in 1 or 2 more, I don't know, but I do just want to say we'll come back to some of this in the second part. So we'll clarify a little more the temporary laws and Psypact and sort of give more risk management tips at that point. Today, we really wanted to focus on getting some clarity around some of these issues of ambiguity.
Right.
Jana, and I will just mention, of course, if you have questions, that this is exactly when, if you're a policyholder, please call in and talk to us on the risk management line, because we're happy to share, we can look up and tell you what the temporary practice laws are. We'll help you think through particular cases. Jana?
Yeah. So one of the things that also is coming up a lot that I just want to clarify, there have been a lot of questions about, Janet, do you know if California is ever going to pass Psypact, or where is Massachusetts on this, or whatever? And what I've tried to respond to a couple of people is that regarding the California situation, I'm licensed in California, so I understand what the issues are. It's important for you to contact the California Psychological Association. They're the entity that can tell you what their stance is, why it's their stance, and what they're doing about it. Psypact has no authority over that, and they don't make decisions about whether or not another state is going to they don't recommend that other states go forward with this process. So California would be the place to ask those questions. So I want to thank you both very much. I want to thank our very large audience, and we know that we didn't get to a lot of the questions, but as Liesl just said, we do have part 2. A lot of the questions that you put in, we will pull out and address that we weren't able to address today. We'll pick the ones that have the most frequency or seem to be the most salient. But I want to thank Liesl for moderating the session, and I certainly want to thank you, Janet, for your time. We know that you face a lot of very controversial questions, and a lot of times people are pretty angry about Psypact. And I think having you on and having you clarify that you've gotten legal consultation about some of these issues, and Psypact has passed the way that it is, and it's not your responsibility to change it. But the fact that you're willing to go and ask for additional information is very welcoming. And I know you'll share that with us, and then we can share it with the folks who are our policyholders. So thank you, Janet, for being willing to be with us today and to answer all of these questions.